March 17th, 1943. The Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. Snow still clung to the pine forests surrounding the concrete bunkers where Germany's high command planned operations across 3 continents. Inside Conference Room 2, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of strong coffee gone cold in porcelain cups. Maps covered every surface: Europe, Africa, the Atlantic, the Eastern Front where hundreds of thousands of men were dying in the mud and ice. Adolf Hitler stood at the head of the table, his uniform pressed, his hands clasped behind his back, listening as Admiral Karl Dönitz presented the latest intelligence summary from the Kriegsmarine's reconnaissance division. The report concerned American naval construction. Hitler had requested the briefing personally, having heard fragmentary reports that troubled him. Dönitz spread aerial reconnaissance photographs across the map table, images of American shipyards taken by long-range Luftwaffe aircraft operating from occupied France, by agents in neutral ports, by U-boat commanders observing through periscopes off the American coast. The photographs showed something that defied military logic: aircraft carriers under construction simultaneously at multiple yards. Not 1 or 2, as naval doctrine suggested. 8, 10, 12. Dönitz's voice was steady, factual, as he delivered the assessment that would shatter Hitler's remaining illusions about America's industrial capacity. Mein Führer, American shipyards are currently producing 8 fleet carriers per year, with production accelerating. They are building carriers faster than we can build destroyers. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Hitler's face flushed crimson, and his voice rose to a shout that echoed off the concrete walls. Das ist unmöglich. It was not impossible. It was happening. And it represented the single most devastating miscalculation of Hitler's entire strategic vision: the belief that America, that distant democracy of shopkeepers and Hollywood actors, could never match the martial prowess of the Third Reich. Hitler had built his ideology on the concept of willpower, of racial destiny, of the superiority of the Aryan warrior over the soft, mongrel populations of democratic nations. He had studied the American Civil War and concluded that Americans lacked the stomach for modern industrial conflict. He had watched America's delayed entry into World War I and interpreted it as weakness rather than deliberation. He had observed the American Depression and seen only chaos and failure. Every calculation, every assumption, every ideological conviction had told him that America posed no serious military threat. The intelligence photographs spread before him now proved that every single assumption had been catastrophically wrong. To understand the magnitude of Hitler's shock, one must first understand what an aircraft carrier represented in 1943. These were not simple vessels. An Essex-class fleet carrier, the type America was mass-producing, was a floating city of war. Each carrier displaced 27 by 100 tons, fully loaded, stretched 872 feet from bow to stern, rose 11 stories from keel to flight deck. Each required 2.5 million man-hours to construct. Each consumed thousands of tons of steel plate, miles of electrical wiring, acres of teak decking, sophisticated radar systems, steam catapults, arresting gear, ammunition magazines, aviation fuel tanks, and aircraft elevators capable of lifting 20-ton bombers from hangar deck to flight deck in seconds. Each carried a crew of 2,600 men and an air group of 90 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Each represented the cutting edge of naval warfare, the weapon system that had rendered battleships obsolete after Pearl Harbor. And America was building 8 of them per year. Germany, by comparison, had never successfully completed a single aircraft carrier. The Graf Zeppelin, laid down in 1936, sat incomplete in Baltic ports, her construction abandoned and resumed multiple times as resources and strategic priorities shifted. The The Kriegsmarine lacked the doctrinal experience, the specialized equipment, the trained pilots, and ultimately the political will to develop carrier aviation. Japan, Germany's Pacific ally, had entered the war with 10 carriers and had pioneered carrier doctrine in the conquest of Southeast Asia. But Japanese shipyards, working at maximum capacity, could produce perhaps 2 carriers per year, and even that rate was unsustainable given Japan's limited steel production and increasingly constrained access to raw materials. America was outbuilding Japan 4-1, and the gap was widening every month. The intelligence Dönitz presented was meticulously documented. The Bethlehem Steel Shipyard at Quincy, Massachusetts, had 3 carriers under construction simultaneously. The Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia was building 4. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard had 2 more on the ways. The Norfolk Naval Shipyard another 2. The New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn was assembling carriers within sight of the Statue of Liberty. Each yard operated around the clock in 3 shifts. Each employed thousands of workers, men and women, since American women had flooded into industrial jobs by the millions to replace men serving overseas. The photographs showed the proof: massive hull sections being welded together, flight decks being fitted, islands rising above the decks, cranes swinging aircraft elevators into position. The scale was unprecedented in naval history. No nation had ever attempted to build capital warships at such speed and in such numbers. Hitler's initial reaction was denial, as it always was when confronted with evidence that contradicted his worldview. "Propaganda!" he shouted, sweeping his hand across the photographs. "American lies meant to demoralize us." But Dönitz was prepared for this response. The Admiral had brought corroborating evidence, intercepted American radio communications discussing carrier deployments, decoded messages referencing specific hull numbers and commissioning dates, reports from German intelligence agents in South America, who had observed American carriers transiting the Panama Canal. The evidence was overwhelming and internally consistent. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, spoke up from his position at the table. "Mein Führer, our analysis suggests these figures are accurate. American industrial capacity exceeds our previous estimates by a factor of 3 or 4. They have mobilized their economy in ways we did not think possible for a democracy." The word democracy hung in the air like an accusation. Everything Hitler believed about the superiority of authoritarian systems, about the efficiency of centralized planning, about the weakness of liberal societies, all of it was being refuted by the evidence on the table. Democracies were supposed to be slow, inefficient, paralyzed by debate and compromise. Authoritarian states were supposed to be decisive, focused, capable of total mobilization. Yet here was America, a raucous democracy where citizens criticized their government openly, where labor unions negotiated with factory owners, where political parties contested elections even during wartime, and this chaotic, undisciplined nation was building aircraft carriers faster than Nazi Germany could build merchant ships. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Hitler demanded to know how such production was possible. Speer provided the analysis. American shipyards had revolutionized carrier construction through prefabrication and modular assembly techniques borrowed from the automobile industry. Major sections of the ship, bow assemblies, stern sections, entire compartments, were built separately in different parts of the shipyard, then brought together and welded into place. This allowed multiple work crews to labor simultaneously on different sections rather than working sequentially. The process reduced construction time from 36 months to 18 months, then to 12. By 1943, American yards were approaching 9-month construction cycles from keel laying to launch. The commissioning of USS Essex in December 1942, USS Yorktown in April 1943, USS Intrepid in August 1943, USS Hornet in November 1943, the pace was relentless. And these were not crude, hastily built vessels. They were sophisticated warships incorporating the latest technology, lessons learned from combat, improvements in damage control and fire suppression systems. But production speed was only part of the equation. The real shock lay in the implications for naval balance of power. Hitler, in his declaration of war against America in December 1941, had believed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had eliminated American naval power in the Pacific for years. He had envisioned a long stalemate during which Germany would consolidate control of Europe, defeat the Soviet Union, and force Britain to negotiate. By the time America rebuilt its fleet, the war would be decided. Now barely 16 months after Pearl Harbor, American carrier strength in the Pacific already exceeded Japanese carrier strength. The battles of the Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers. America had already replaced those losses and added more. By mid-1943, the United States Navy would operate more fleet carriers than the rest of the world combined. By 1944, American carriers would outnumber Axis carriers by ratios approaching 10-1. The emotional contrast between German expectations and reality was stark. Germany had entered the war with confidence in its military superiority, in the invincibility of the Wehrmacht, in the decisiveness of blitzkrieg tactics. Poland fell in weeks. France fell in 6 weeks. Yugoslavia fell in 11 days. Greece fell in 3 weeks. The pattern seemed clear. German military prowess was unmatched. The Soviet Union was supposed to fall in 3 months. Instead, it had absorbed the full weight of the Wehrmacht for 20 months and was still fighting. Britain was supposed to collapse under aerial bombardment. Instead, it had endured and was now building strength for an eventual invasion of the continent. And now America, which was supposed to be weak, divided, and incapable of projecting power, America was building a fleet that would dominate every ocean simultaneously. German soldiers who had marched into Paris in triumph, who had raised the swastika over the Acropolis, who had pushed to the gates of Moscow, now faced the grim realization that material superiority might matter more than courage or tactical brilliance. The symbolic object that came to dominate Hitler's thinking about American industrial power was not the aircraft carrier itself, but the assembly line, that quintessentially American innovation that had revolutionized industrial production in the 1920s and now was being applied to weapons of war. Henry Ford's assembly line had made automobiles affordable to ordinary Americans, producing Model T cars at rates and prices that European manufacturers thought impossible. Now that same philosophy, standardization, interchangeable parts, specialized labor, continuous flow production, was being applied to destroyers, cruisers, carriers, bombers, tanks. The assembly line represented everything Hitler despised about American culture: its materialism, its emphasis on quantity over quality, its reduction of skilled craftsmanship to repetitive tasks, its celebration of efficiency over artistry. But the assembly line worked. It produced weapons in quantities that overwhelmed German precision engineering and Japanese warrior spirit. Hitler's response to the carrier intelligence evolved through predictable stages. First came denial, the insistence that the reports were exaggerated or fabricated. When denial became untenable, anger followed. Hitler raged at his military staff, at German intelligence services, at the Kriegsmarine for failing to match American production, at the Luftwaffe for losing air superiority that might have allowed bombing of American shipyards. When anger exhausted itself, bargaining emerged. Perhaps German submarines could sink the carriers faster than America could build them. Perhaps Japan could slow American advances through fanatical defense of Pacific islands. Perhaps new technology, jet aircraft, acoustic torpedoes, guided missiles, could offset American numerical advantages. Each hope proved illusory. American production continued to accelerate. German countermeasures proved inadequate. And slowly, inexorably, the reality settled in. Germany had entered a war it could not win against an enemy whose industrial capacity exceeded Germany's by factors so large they seemed almost abstract. The documented evidence of Hitler's statements during this period comes from multiple sources. Albert Speer, in his memoirs written after the war, recalled Hitler's reaction to the carrier intelligence. He seemed genuinely shocked, almost disoriented. For the first time, I saw him confront the possibility that we had already lost the war, not through military defeat, but through industrial incapacity. He kept returning to the question, how can a democracy organize such production? It violated everything he believed about racial hierarchy and authoritarian efficiency. General Walter Warlimont, deputy chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, recorded in his diary that Hitler obsessed over American production figures throughout the spring of 1943, demanding constant updates, comparing German and American output in every category, searching desperately for some metric that showed German superiority. In every category, aircraft, tanks, ships, ammunition, vehicles, America was outproducing Germany by ratios of 2-to-1, 3-to-1, sometimes 5-to-1. What made these figures even more devastating was the context. Germany was fully mobilized for total war. Its economy was organized entirely around military production. Civilian consumption had been reduced to minimum levels. Forced labor from occupied territories supplied millions of workers. Resources from conquered nations flowed to German factories. The entire apparatus of the Nazi state was devoted to producing weapons. And still, America outproduced Germany while maintaining higher civilian living standards, while feeding and equipping Allied forces across the globe, while building a strategic bomber fleet that would eventually reduce German cities to rubble. The United States was fighting a two-front war against Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific, and still maintained production levels that exceeded Germany's focused, total mobilization. This was the fact that shattered Hitler's ideological foundations. The transformation this knowledge wrought in German strategic thinking was profound and ultimately futile. By mid-1943, German military planning shifted from offensive operations aimed at victory to defensive operations aimed at prolonging the conflict, hoping for political collapse among the Allies or some miraculous intervention. Hitler became obsessed with wonder weapons, the V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile, jet fighters, acoustic torpedoes, super-heavy tanks. These weapons represented technological sophistication, areas where German engineering might retain superiority over American mass production. But wonder weapons came too late and in insufficient numbers. The Me-2262 jet fighter was a remarkable aircraft, but Germany produced fewer than 1,400 of them. America produced 300,000 aircraft during the war, most of them perfectly adequate propeller-driven planes that achieved air superiority through overwhelming numbers. The Tiger tank was superior to the American Sherman in armor and firepower, but Germany built 1,247 Tigers, while America built 49 versus 134 Shermans. Mathematics replaced ideology. The U-boat campaign against American shipping illustrated the hopelessness of Germany's position. Admiral Dönitz believed that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would cripple the Allied war effort, starving Britain and preventing American military buildup. In early 1943, U-boats briefly achieved these sinking rates, and German propaganda celebrated the successes. But American shipyards were producing merchant vessels, the famous Liberty ships, faster than U-boats could sink them. In 1943, American yards produced 19 million tons of new shipping. German submarines, suffering increasing losses from improved Allied anti-submarine warfare, sank 3.2 million tons. The Allied merchant fleet grew by 16 million tons in a single year. Every statistic told the same story. Germany was losing a war of attrition against American industrial capacity. The psychological impact on German forces, especially naval and air crews who encountered American material superiority directly, was corrosive. Luftwaffe pilots returning from missions over Germany described the sky as black with American bombers, formations of B-17s and B-24s protected by clouds of escort fighters. U-boat crews who survived encounters with American hunter-killer groups, destroyer escorts, and small carriers operating in teams reported being overwhelmed by coordinated attacks involving radar, sonar, depth charges, and aircraft. German sailors who fought American task forces in the few surface engagements that occurred described battles where American ships kept fighting even after sustaining damage that would have crippled German vessels, their redundant systems and superior damage control keeping them in action. The ideological narrative of German superiority could not survive contact with American abundance. Hitler's private comments on American carriers, recorded by several witnesses in his inner circle, revealed the depth of his miscalculation. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, noted in his diary, "The Führer spoke at length tonight about American carrier production. He seems unable to comprehend how they achieve such output." He called it Jewish capitalism at work, but his voice lacked conviction. I believe he knows we are beaten, but cannot admit it, even to himself. At a military conference in July 1943, Hitler reportedly said, "If they can build 8 carriers in a year, how many bombers are they building? How many tanks? How many ships? The numbers become meaningless. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an economy, and their economy is 10 times larger than ours." The admission was remarkable for its clarity, though it came too late to change German strategy. The contrast between American and German approaches to warfare crystallized in the carrier production figures. German military culture emphasized individual excellence, tactical brilliance, the heroism of single warriors or small units. German propaganda celebrated knights of the air, panzer aces, U-boat commanders who sank thousands of tons of shipping. These heroes existed and their skills were genuine. But America's approach was institutional, systematic, industrial. American carriers operated in task groups, coordinating multiple ships with interlocking air defenses. American aircraft flew in formations with assigned roles and mutual support. American production ensured that losses were quickly replaced, allowing units to maintain combat effectiveness through sheer availability of replacement equipment and personnel. The American system was designed to function regardless of individual heroism, and it worked. By late 1943, the strategic situation had become irreversible. American carriers dominated the Pacific, supporting island-hopping campaigns that pushed inexorably toward Japan. In the Atlantic, American-built ships carried millions of tons of supplies to Britain and Russia, sustaining Allied forces and economies. In the Mediterranean, American carriers supported the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. By 1944, American carriers would support the Normandy invasion, providing air cover and close air support that suppressed German coastal defenses. The carrier, that weapon system Germany had never mastered, became the symbol of American power projection, the instrument that allowed America to fight simultaneously in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, thousands of miles from American shores. Hitler's final references to American carrier production came in the last months of his life, as Allied armies closed on Berlin from east and west. In the Führer bunker, 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler held increasingly surreal military conferences with generals commanding armies that no longer existed, planning counteroffensives with divisions that had been destroyed. Weeks earlier, in one of these conferences recorded by stenographers who survived the war, Hitler returned to the subject of American carriers. "We should have built carriers," he said. "We should have recognized what they represented. Not just ships, but a philosophy of war. They build them like automobiles, without artistry, without pride, just production. And production won. They buried us in production." General Alfred Jodl, his chief of operations, reportedly responded, "It is too late for such reflections, mein Führer." Hitler's reply was bitter. "It was too late the moment I declared war on America. I see that now. Everything since has been a slow defeat." The epilogue to this story of industrial miscalculation extended far beyond the defeat of Nazi Germany. The American carriers that Hitler viewed with such shock and dread did not return home after victory and rust in harbors. They continued service for decades, some being modernized and rebuilt multiple times, participating in Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War confrontations that defined the second half of the 20th century. The Essex-class carriers, those mass-produced marvels of wartime construction, remained in active service into the 1970s, 30 years after their construction. Several survive today as museum ships, floating monuments to the industrial democracy that built them. The USS Intrepid sits at a Manhattan pier, a museum visited by thousands annually. The USS Yorktown rests in Charleston Harbor. The USS Hornet is preserved in Alameda, California. These ships, built in months during wartime emergency, outlasted the 1,000-year Reich by half a century. The lesson Hitler learned too late, that industrial capacity matters more than ideology, that democratic systems can mobilize effectively when threatened, that abundance is a weapon more powerful than courage alone, became the defining insight of the post-war order. The Cold War competition between the United States and Soviet Union was fundamentally an industrial competition, a test of which economic system could produce more weapons, more consumer goods, higher living standards, greater technological innovation. The Soviet Union, despite its authoritarian structure and centralized planning, could never match American productive capacity. The assembly lines that built carriers in 1943 built automobiles in the 1950s, computers in the 1980s, and the technologies that continue to define the global economy. The industrial democracy Hitler dismissed as weak and decadent proved to be the most powerful military and economic system in human history. The aircraft carrier, that recurring symbol of American power, represented something deeper than naval capability. Each carrier was a testament to free labor, to workers who chose to take factory jobs, who innovated and improved production techniques, who took pride in their output because they believed in the cause. The carriers were built not by slave labor or forced conscription, but by men and women earning wages, supporting families, planning futures. This distinction mattered. Free workers produced better results than coerced workers. Democratic societies, for all their apparent chaos and inefficiency, could organize collective effort more effectively than totalitarian states when their populations were convinced of the necessity. Hitler never understood this because his entire ideology rested on the opposite assumption: that coercion was more efficient than consent, that hierarchy was stronger than equality, that willpower could overcome material disadvantage. The production figures that shocked Hitler in March 1943 continued to accelerate throughout the war. By 1944, American shipyards had produced 24 Essex-class carriers plus dozens of smaller escort carriers. By 1945, American naval aviation could put more aircraft in the air from carrier decks than many nations possessed in their entire air forces. The final irony was that most of these carriers never fired a shot in anger. They were built as insurance, as overwhelming force that deterred even the thought of resistance. The carrier task forces that approached Japan in 1945 represented such concentrated power that Japanese defenders simply could not contest them effectively. The war ended not with a climactic naval battle, but with Japan's surrender in the face of insurmountable material superiority, its cities destroyed by strategic bombing, its economy strangled by submarine blockade, its military capacity exhausted. In the forests of East Prussia, in the concrete bunkers of the Wolf's Lair, where Hitler first learned of American carrier production, nothing remains but ruins overgrown with trees and weeds. The maps are gone, the photographs destroyed, the coffee cups shattered. But the carriers remain, or their descendants do, supercarriers now, displacing 100,000 tons, carrying nuclear reactors and jet aircraft, but still embodying the same principle that shocked Hitler in 1943. They are instruments of industrial democracy, of free people organized for collective purpose, of an economic system that rewards innovation and efficiency. They are proof that abundance is not weakness, that prosperity and military power are not contradictory, that democracies can fight and win when their principles are threatened. The assembly line continues to run, though now it produces technologies Hitler never imagined. The lesson remains: underestimate democratic industrial capacity at your peril. Hitler made that mistake and paid for it with his empire, his ideology, and, ultimately, his life. The carriers that proved his undoing sailed on, delivering aircraft that bombed his cities into rubble, supporting armies that crushed his forces in France and Germany, demonstrating with mathematical precision that ideology cannot defeat production, that willpower cannot overcome material reality, that freedom, when armed with industry, is the most powerful force on Earth. 8 carriers per year. The number seemed impossible. It was merely the beginning.